Tom on W1TP. I was a professor of neuroscience, brain science in real life, and a ham radio operator for, 63 years or so. And I was always interested in coding methodology, how the brain codes information. And I also was always interested in Morse code with ham radio. I found it particularly hard to learn Morse code, so I started collecting telegraph keys at a very early age, and I ended up, like most collectors, just overdoing it ridiculously. I ended up with 3,000 telegraph keys. Yeah, my wife said the same thing. So I wrote books about them, made CDs, and if you go into my website, w1tp.com, you will see all 3,000 keys now up on the website in the form of a telegraph key museum. Fascinating stuff. And while I was in Germany hunting for telegraph keys, a guy came up to me and said, you know, would you be interested in a German Enigma machine? And I can't keep a poker face, so my eyes lit up like that, and they said, oh, yes, I can see you would. And he offered me this machine. It was the first Enigma machine I'd ever seen in person, and I bought it at that point, and I started learning about Enigmas, and followed that up by buying more and more of them, and now I'm addicted to Enigmas in the same way that I'm addicted to telegraph keys. And therefore, I now have a museum on the internet called enigmamuseum.com. So if you come to that museum, you'll see some of my Enigmas. You're also going to see them tonight. What I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about the movie Imitation Game and how the Enigma fitted in, and generally a lot about the Enigma. How many of you have seen that movie? Okay, that's good. Pretty good number. And I'll assume that the rest of you can perhaps see it at some point, and you'll catch on to what's going on. Basically, this guy over here, Benedict Cumberbatch, played Alan Turing in the movie. And the movie talks about how he cracked the Enigma code single-handed, and there are a few distortions of history there, and part of my job is to set some of those distortions correct. So let's start out at the beginning. We start out at the end of World War I, in which Europe was recovering from World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, divided Germany into two parts, a big part and a little part with Poland in the middle. And this did not make Germany very happy, obviously. And in addition, it forbade Germany to have an army or an air force or a navy. So again, Germany was not at all happy about this settlement. And there was one particular German who was very unhappy about this, and he screamed and yelled and stirred up the people and said, we've got to get Germany back together again. We have to unite. We're going to do anything that's necessary to do it. And very quietly and without telling anybody, he started building up the German army. And he did it by training his soldiers in hunting clubs. The soldiers would go off in the woods, supposedly to practice hunting, but they were actually practicing military maneuvers, tank driving, and other things. He trained his Air Force by training the pilots in so-called glider clubs, community glider clubs, and trained lots and lots of pilots, and gradually build up the German Air Force and the German Army in that way. The Navy was basically the same thing. He trained the crews who would eventually man the battleships and submarines in local sailing clubs. It was pretty transparent, and a lot of people knew what he was doing, but nobody really called him on that, and consequently he got away with it. And the result was that he was building up these things, but at the same time, all branches of the German military used the Enigma machine. They used the Enigma machine in order to hide what it was that they were doing. They didn't want the world to know that they were breaking the convention. And so the submarine operators, soldiers in the field, and all of the soldiers in the field used these things called Enigma machines to communicate, and nobody in the world was able to read their codes. so it was pretty secure. People didn't catch on to what Hitler was doing for quite a while. The submarines, very ugly-looking machines, really built for only one purpose, and that is killing. He built a lot of submarines. Here's a picture of a submarine in the North Sea and a submarine in rather cold conditions. It had a very large navy consisting of a lot of submarines and sent them out. And the idea was he wanted to use these submarines to blockade Europe and to simply cut off Europe from any outside supplies, specifically to starve England and keep them from getting the supplies they needed to continue as a country. The result was that he ended up with his submarines sinking 3,000 Allied ships, American ships, British ships. That's a lot of shipping. And of course, along with those 3,000 ships, he killed many, many more thousands of people. Total of 15 million tons. And every single one of his U-boats had an Enigma on it. As a matter of fact, it had 2 Enigmas on it. And the U-boat radio operators were trained how to use Enigmas, and they constantly sent messages from the U-boats back to the high command reporting where they were and what the U-boats were doing. So let's take a look at the Enigma machine itself, the history of the Enigma, and how it was set up. It was invented by a German inventor named Arthur Scherbius in 1918, and he built this horrible thing over here. Weighed about 300 pounds, cost about $30,000 at that point, and nobody bought it. His idea was that every company would want to have several of these to keep their internal communication secret, but they didn't. They simply didn't want to spend that much money. And so he changed his design and put it into a case about the size of a typewriter. You can see one right up here on the left end of the table. And that design stayed the same all the way from 1922, when he first produced this smaller version, all the way to the end of the war in 1945. So the Enigma machine, well, he's standardized on that. And the Enigma machine is based on something called a substitution code. And the substitution code traces back to Julius Caesar, who used a substitution code to keep his messages secret. And it also traced his way back before Julius Caesar to people who also were using substitution codes. So let's look at a substitution code for a moment and see how it works. This is the alphabet, the plain text alphabet that we're used to, A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. And you can confuse people by having every letter in this alphabet associated with another letter in the same alphabet, but a different letter. So, for instance, in this alphabet, A could be associated with X, B with Y, C with Z, D with A, and so on. The initial alphabet up here is called the plain text, and that is the letters that you want to encode, to make secret. And down here we have what is called the ciphertext, or the secret text. And these are the letters that you don't want people to understand. So, for instance, if you want to encode the letter A, you use the letter X down here instead. And people have to figure out somehow, if they're able to, that X really stands for A. Another example of the Caesar code is the well-known code wheel. Those of you who are old enough to remember, you could open breakfast cereal and you ate your cereal, and inside would be a Dick Tracy code wheel, sort of like this. But that traces way back to the days of the Civil War. And this code wheel is actually a code wheel that was used by the CSA, the Confederate States of America, to encode messages. And let's see how the code wheel works, because it really gives us an insight into how the Enigma machine works. The first thing you have to do with the code wheel is set this rotatable inner dial to a particular setting with respect to the outer dial. In this case, that setting is outer A is equal to inner X. And that is called the days key. That's the setting of the code wheel. And you leave the code wheel set like that, and you do all your encoding and decoding with the code wheel with it set with the days key of A equals X. So let's encode my name then, Tom. we look at the T on the outer wheel, and we see that it encodes to Q. Q, then, is the coded version of the T in my name. The O becomes L, and the M becomes J. So the ciphertext version of my name, instead of Tom, is QLJ. So you send that off to some other place, like you want to tell a general this secret code, this word Tom. You take this QLJ and you have a runner, a delivery person, or a Morse code message sent to another general in another part of the war. And that general also has a code wheel just like this. And he knows that he has to set his code wheel to this same day's key, A equals X. Then, when he gets the message QLJ, he has to decipher it. And so he looks up the Q and finds out that it's a T, looks up the L, finds out that it's an O, and the J becomes M. And lo and behold, he has now recovered the original text. That's how the code wheel works, and that, surprisingly, is how the Enigma machine works. The only thing different, and the brilliant thing about the Enigma machine, is that the man who invented it, Scherbius, instead of leaving it set like this throughout the whole day, every time you encode a letter, like T, it spins the inner wheel to a new position. That's the difference. So you could encode the letter T 3 times and get 3 different encoded versions of the letter T. And let's take a look at the Enigma machine then. First of all, we have a keyboard up here, which is a normal keyboard with the letters of the alphabet on it. And we have back here a light bulb panel that has the same letters of the alphabet on it. And when you press on the keyboard the letter A light lights up, and in this case the letter would be X. So A is encoded as X. X is the ciphertext or coded version of the letter A. Now, you would think with the Civil War code wheel that if you pushed the letter A again, you would get X again. But that's not what happens with an Enigma machine. With an Enigma machine, these rotors that you see back here rotate 1 notch every time you type in a letter. So when you type in the letter A the next time, instead of getting the letter X, you get the letter R. R lights up. And if you type A again, K lights up. And if you type A again, B lights up. So it's a very clever device which changes its internal wiring, essentially, every time you type in a letter. The way it works, for those of you who are happy with circuit boards, we'll just trace circuit diagrams. It would just trace the electrical signal. The letter T that you're typing in as the first letter closes a normally open set of contacts, and that sends an electrical signal up into a plug board. The plug board may be set so that the letter T is jumpered over to the letter K. The letter T now is transposed over to a different letter. The K goes up into the entrance of a set of 3 rotors, and I pointed those out earlier. Comes in as a K, and it enters the first rotor, and it goes through the wiring maze of that rotor and comes out as a different letter. And then it goes into the next rotor and comes out as a different letter, goes into the next rotor, comes out as a different letter, and then at the end of this stack of 3 rotors, it goes into something called a reflector, which simply turns the voltage around and sends it back out through another contact, goes back through this rotor and comes out as a different letter. This rotor comes out as a different letter. This rotor, a different letter. And eventually it finds its way back into the plug board, where it comes out as a W. The W is then jumpered over to the letter G. And finally, after all of that, we see that the light bulb G lights up. So basically, it's not much more complicated than a flashlight. You press a switch, and a battery sends a voltage and lights up a light bulb. But the number of possible settings of the machine is extraordinary. Let's look at how an Enigma machine works in practice. We have 2 Enigma machines, one let's say on board a ship, and the other one at a shore receiving radio station. Let's say the person on the ship wants to send the letter Y and make it secret. He types in the letter Y on the keyboard, and the Enigma machine lights up, let's say, the letter G. The letter G is then sent by radio or telephone or messenger to the receiving Enigma machine. And as long as the receiving Enigma machine is set to the same starting day's key position, and that's critical, when you type in the G on the keyboard of this machine, and as long as it's set to the same starting position as this machine, the output, the letter that lights up, will be the original letter. So basically that is how Enigma machines work. You type in a letter, comes out a coded version of the letter as lighted up light. You type in that coded version on another Enigma, and it comes out the original letter. The difficult thing is that there are a lot of possible initial settings. As you could see with the Civil War code wheel, there were only 26 possible days keys. A equals X is the one we had, but there are only 26 possible settings because there are only 26 letters in the alphabet. With an Enigma machine, there are 3 rotors, and the rotors can be moved along the axle in various ways so as to switch them around. It could be 1, 2, 3 or 1, 3, 2. And so on. That gives us 60 possible positions of the rotors. The rotors all have an internal adjustment, and there are 676 possible internal adjustments. The initial starting position of each rotor is variable, and there are 17,576 possible initial starting positions. And the jumper cable selections on the plug board on the front, there are 5 times 10 to the 15th power possibility. And if you take all those possibilities and you calculate how many possible initial days keys there are in a 3-rotor Enigma, you find that the number is 10 to the 114th power. That's 10 followed by 114 zeros. Big number, especially when you realize that all of the atoms in the entire observable universe only number about 10 to the 80th power. As a result, the people who were using these Enigma machines figured it was basically impossible that anybody would ever figure out which one of the 10 to the 114th power possibilities was being used as the day's key on a particular day. And the person who was so absolutely confident of that was a man named Karl Dönitz. He was the Grand Admiral, the Führer of U-boats, and he was an idiot, a real idiot, as we will see, because he was absolutely certain that there was no way that anybody could ever read his Enigma-coded messages because there were too many possibilities for anyone to guess in a million lifetimes. And so, good old Dönitz decided, I'm so safe, I am going to insist that every one of my U-boats out here report back to me every day the exact latitude, longitude position where they are. It's like having a GPS reporting to you every day. Hey, I'm at this location. So every U-boat in the entire German Navy sent these messages back to Dönitz, and of course, they were intercepted by the Allies. And they listened in on these messages, and they read this cipher text, these coded letters. But at first, they couldn't make any sense of them. But then gradually they learned how to decode the messages, and indeed that is probably one of the major factors why Germany lost the war. Although the U-boats were the greatest danger in World War II, and that was Churchill's statement, the U-boat menace was gradually overcome mostly by Enigma deciphering. And here's where Alan Turing comes in to save the day in the imitation game. Alan Turing to the rescue, and the movie shows Alan Turing having this great breakthrough. He is figuring out how this Enigma machine works, and suddenly he says, I have it! I know how to decode the Enigma. I particularly like this movie, by the way, because that is one of my Enigma machines in the movie. That's an Enigma that I found. I'll talk about it a little later, but that made me very happy to see one of my Enigmas starring, in quotes, in that movie. Anyway, Alan Turing has this great breakthrough, and of course it turns out that in actuality people were successfully reading the codes 6 years before Alan Turing even came on the scene, and I'm going to explain that to you. But I wanted you to see the distortion of the movie here, in that they have sort of claimed that it was he who broke the Enigma code. The imitation game talks about how Alan Turing designed and built the first Bomba. The Bomba is the name that is given to a machine like this, very complicated machine, that is capable of breaking the Enigma code. And it turns out that, as I'm going to explain, it was not the first bomb that he built. In the movie, he also, it says that he named his bomb Christopher, after a childhood friend of his. In actuality, he named the Bomba that he built Victory. And there were a lot of other distortions in the movie. Every movie has to have a villain, and Alastair Denison over here is the villain in the movie. But in actuality, he was a great supporter of Turing, but he comes off as a tremendous villain in the movie. And there was a detective down here who went after Turing and thought that he was a spy. In actuality, nobody ever accused Turing of being a spy or anything else. So these are major distortions in the movie done for the dramatic effect primarily. However, as we move through the movie, we do get into some things that are pretty accurate. For instance, it did become possible for the British to read the German Enigma messages using Turing's bomb. And they did read the naval Enigma messages, and it also posed an interesting dilemma for these people, because the deciphering of the Enigma had to be hidden from the Germans. If the Germans found out that the British were reading the Enigma messages, they would have simply stopped using the Enigma, and that would have cut off the British from knowing what was going on. And that, unfortunately, sometimes required the sacrifice of lives. Sometimes ships had to be allowed to be torpedoed to prevent the Germans from knowing that the Allies knew exactly where a submarine was. And although the movie suggests that it was Turing who made those decisions, it was actually Churchill who made the decisions as to whether to warn a ship, for instance, and have it take a different course to avoid the submarine, or whether to allow it to be sunk to keep the Germans from figuring out that their Enigma code was insecure. Let's go on and look at the real story of deciphering the Enigma. What really happened? Really, the Polish Cipher Bureau was responsible for deciphering the Enigma, and 3 brilliant Polish mathematicians who deserve most of the credit. And if you hunt through the movie, there are only 2 little sentences in the whole movie that mentions the word Polish. One, and they're both wrong. One of the references says Polish intelligence smuggled it out of Berlin. Totally wrong. They intercepted it in a Polish post office, it being an Enigma machine. And the lower one is even more upsetting. Turing's bombs were inspired by an old Polish code machine. And that's really wrong, because it was the Poles who built the first bombs, as we will see. Let's go back to Europe after World War I. We see that Poland is right in the middle of Germany here. The Polish people knew that the Germans were going to eventually invade their country and try and unify Germany again. So they read the German secret messages to find out when Germany was going to invade. And at one point, these messages, the Poles were concerned about the invasion, and at one point in 1928, the Polish people were unable to break the German code. The Germans had been using a hand cipher code, no machine. and suddenly it became unbreakable for them. And in 1929, a package was intercepted by Polish customs in a railroad station and a post office in Warsaw, Poland, and they opened it without telling the Germans, and inside was an Enigma machine. So this was the first that they saw of an Enigma machine. And they studied it, they took it apart, reversed engineered it, figured out the circuit diagram, put it back together real quick, and packed it up so the Germans wouldn't know, but at least they knew now what kind of a machine was coding messages. The problem was the machine that they took apart was a commercial Enigma machine that did not have the same wiring, rotor wiring, that the military version had. And then in 1932, a German spy sold some code books to the Poles. Code books are what give the day's key for an entire month of Enigma codes. So the Poles were able to study that, and eventually these three brilliant Polish mathematicians were able to deduce the Enigma wiring, exactly how each of the rotors was wired. They then built Enigma replicas. They built machines that were essentially exact replicas of the Enigma and worked the same, so they could study and decode messages. And finally, they built bombs to decipher the Enigma messages. These are the three mathematicians, Rejewski, Zygalski, and Rosicky, with Rejewski being the primary brains behind the deciphering of the Enigma and the figuring out of the wiring. And this is what we mean when we say the wiring maze in a rotor of an Enigma. The input side of the rotor is over here, and every pin, every one of the 26 pins over here, is connected by a wire to some one other of the 26 pins on the other side. So this is input and output, and the mathematicians figured out exactly which input pins were connected to which output pins. Many people think that this is the most brilliant mathematical feat ever performed by mathematicians. Very, very complex to do that. The Polish then built their own Enigma replicas, and this is not an Enigma. This is a machine that the Poles built that works just like the Enigma, and it's wired like the Enigma, and they use that to help them decode messages. They also built a machine which they named a bomba. Nobody's really sure why they called it a bomba. One possibility is it makes a ticking sound like a time bomb when it's operating. The other possibility is it was named after a Polish dessert called a bomba, sort of a chocolate, round, wonderful thing. And nobody's sure why. But anyway, they built this thing, and it spins the rotors that are the same wiring as an Enigma rotor here and over here, using a motor, and lights up little lights here, and eventually it can figure out by iterating through all of the combinations of the Enigma, it can decipher the Enigma messages. They then got a little fancier and built an even more complex bomba, and electric motor driven. You can see the three rotors up here, and they spin around and lights flash over here, and eventually you figure out the Enigma message. And the Poles used their bombs to decipher the German Enigma messages for a full 6 years before Poland was invaded by Germany. And in 1939, Poland was invaded by Germany, and the Polish mathematicians managed to escape to England with their Enigmas. They couldn't actually bring the bombs. They brought the bomb plans, and they gave them to the British at Bletchley Park. In 1939, then, the Poles give their Enigma replicas and bomb plans to the British. 1939, the British take over code breaking because there is no more Poland at that point, and they gave no credit to the Poles at all. They just said, thank you, goodbye. They wouldn't even let the Polish mathematicians work on decoding any more messages. They simply kicked them out of Bletchley Park and said, we can't use you anymore. And it was only in 1999, that's 60 years after the Poles gave this to the British that the British finally erected a monument to the Polish mathematicians at Bletchley Park. And the only reason they did it was that there were some Poles screaming at them very noisily in the newspapers, and they finally had to do it. So they put up a little monument saying, oh, by the way, thanks, Poles. We appreciate your help on this. But the Poles did it, and that's the thing that so few people, unfortunately, know. In Bletchley Park, this estate and many outbuildings were taken over and filled with code breakers. And they had eventually, at the peak of the war, when the most numbers were there were 10,000 people working in this area, breaking the Enigma code. And they used the exact techniques initially that the Poles had given them. Turing was a brilliant person, and he extended them and improved them and made them much faster. There's no question we're not detracting from Turing's work. I'm just upset that they never bothered to credit the Poles for having gotten them started. The people who worked at Bletchley Park kept their secret for 30 years after the war. So every one of the 10,000 code breakers had been initially initiated into Bletchley Park with a gun at their head. And they were all indoctrinated by saying, listen, we're going to be working on secret projects, and if you ever tell anybody, and I mean anybody, wife, children, husband, anybody, we will kill you. This is absolutely no question. They were scared enough so that none of the 10,000 people told anybody that they had done this work for a total of 30 years after the war. And that means all the way from 1945, 1975, nobody knew that the Enigma machine had been cracked. Probably the best kept secret of all time, and amazingly well kept. The result of this was that it was not until 1975 that people learned that the Enigma had been deciphered. And that suddenly forced all of these historians to throw out these lengthy books that they'd written on the history of World War II. Look at all the books here that were written about the history of World War II, literally hundreds of them. These are just a few that I happen to have. So if you're interested in World War II, the first thing you should do is look in the front of the book and see if it was published before or after 1975. If it was published before 75, throw it away, because the cracking of the Enigma code was extremely important in the entire course of the war. Good old Dönitz, remember the head of the U-boats and all that? He still doesn't believe it. Didn't believe it in 1975. He didn't believe it in 1985. He didn't believe it in 1995. He eventually died. He still didn't believe that they had cracked his code. He thought it was a wonderful new kind of British radar that had been invented, or an ability to see over the horizon or something. He was just very stubborn about this. Anyway, let's look at Turing. Turing was a very great person and a brilliant mathematician. He did indeed design the Turing bomb, which is pretty closely mimicked in the movie. And what he did was to take the Polish design without ever telling anybody thank you or anything, and he expanded it into a multi-rotor machine that we see here, very, very complex. And what you do is you start this thing going, all these rotors start rotating, and they're trying different combinations of the Enigma rotors until they come out with a setting that gives him the day's key. The back of the bomb is horrendous. I've seen this thing. It's just, this is not a small machine. It's 7 feet high and about 15 feet wide, and it's just all circuitry. And Turing was just an amazing, brilliant person to have built this thing. No question about it. Turing's contributions were deciphering the Enigma using the Polish bombs and discovering that it was too slow. And so he figured out ways to speed it up by building the bomb that we just saw. And since the Germans were continually improving their Enigmas and adding more rotors, adding more complex versions, Turing discovered ways to decipher them and designed and built entirely new bombs. Here's one that he built later on, near the end of the war. And the idea was you couldn't spin rotors fast enough, and so he used punch paper tape that you see over here on a very, very fast operating paper tape reader to run the ciphertext message through this machine. And many people credit him for having been the first person to invent a programmable computer when he designed the decoding bomb that he called Colossus. That's an arguable point because the definition of a programmable computer varies according to who you talk to. There's no question he built something that formed the groundwork for computers, but whether he was the first is something open to argue. He also helped the Americans build their own bombs. In Dayton, Ohio, there's a company called the National Cash Register Company, and they made cash registers. But during the war, in total top secret, they also made bombs. And this is a National Cash Register bomb. And you'll notice it has stacks of 4 rotors instead of 3. Dönitz finally, near the end of the war, said, something weird's going on here. My submarines are getting sunk an awful lot, and I want to put a 4th rotor on my Enigma. And so he insisted that his Enigmas for his submarines have 4 rotors instead of 3. And that would have been really good. It would have kept people from reading his Enigma messages for quite a while till they figured out how to do it using a machine like this. But the unfortunate thing for Dönitz was that he came into conflict with Göring. Göring was the head of the German Air Force, and Göring said, "Nein, you cannot make an Enigma that I cannot read with my 3-rotor Enigma." And so he said, "You cannot do that." And so what Dönitz did was to make his 4-rotor Enigma a separate machine, but if you set the left-handmost rotor to the letter A, then it became electrically exactly the same as a 3-rotor Enigma. And that was ridiculous because that immediately gave it away to the Allies, all of the wiring. It was very clear. It made it so that the 4-rotor Enigma was not very difficult to decode after all. And indeed, when the Germans brought in the 4-rotor Enigma, they used 3-rotor Enigmas to describe what they were doing and tell everybody about it. And of course, at that point, Turing and the British were reading the code. They knew all about that anyway. So, big mistake. Turing was helped by a number of additional techniques, the capture of code books from U-boats. Once in a while, a U-boat would be captured rather than sunk. If the captain, for instance, failed to pull the release valves appropriately or wanted to get all the crew off before the boat sank. And when an Enigma was captured, people would go into the Enigma and grab the code books. And the code book gave the day's key settings for 2 whole months. So for an entire 2 months, the British knew the exact day's key settings for the German Enigmas whenever they were able to capture a submarine or another vessel. There were also repeated predictable words in messages. You could start hunting for the word Hitler, and you could be pretty sure that a long message was probably going to have the word Hitler in it, or Heil Hitler, or something like that. And also the call signs of the weather ships that were broadcasting in Enigma code were always the same. They knew what the weather ship call sign was, and they knew what weather ship was broadcasting by direction finding, and they could then use that to help them decode the message. Many other discoveries and techniques were used. If you're interested in the history, wonderful readable book by David Kahn called Seizing the Enigma gives a very nice overview of it. They also captured weather ships. The British captured weather ships, and this is a ship in the North Sea sending weather reports back. And they had to get the crew off the weather ship and get them below blindfolded so that they wouldn't see that the British were going on board and removing the Enigmas and the code books. Because even prisoners of war, if they had seen that, there was always a network where German prisoners of war could get messages back home, and they would have said, "Hey, they're reading our Enigma messages, do something." At the end of the war, the German U-boats were sunk by primarily Enigma deciphering. Direction finding helped, of course, a lot. And it is thought that this shortened the war by about 2 years, saved thousands of lives, and ultimately, by ending the war early, it prevented Hitler from completing the atomic bomb. And what happened was that since the U-boats were broadcasting their location in latitude, longitude, the ships would go out and drop depth charges and blow up the submarines. But Churchill always had to have some kind of a cover story, so it didn't look like we were reading the latitude, longitude messages from these U-boats. And the typical cover story was that he would fly an observation plane over the submarine, and it would look like it had just flown over by accident. And the observation plane would fly over the submarine would radio back to Dönitz, "Oops, I think I've been spotted by an observation plane, I'm diving." And then the boat would come along, sink the U-boat, and Dönitz would never hear from that submarine again, and he would assume that it was spotted by the observation plane and sunk for that reason, not ever figuring out that the code had been broken. Another factor that nobody has ever read about before, because I was the first person to discover it, is that some of the Enigma machines were actually sabotaged by the Jewish workers who were forced in the factories to build Enigma machines. And I've taken apart a lot of Enigma machines, and I've been hunting for them for about 30 years, and I find signs of sabotage. This is the simplest kind of sabotage. One of the plugs that goes in the plug board was just kicking around inside the bottom of an Enigma. And I could tell it wasn't an accident because this plug had never been wired in place. It was underneath there. And the critical thing about sabotaging something is that it has to pass the initial inspection, has to pass the inspector first before it can do any good. So the machine has to work for a while and then stop working. And the neat thing about putting a little plug in here is that this bar here has to move down all the way almost to the bottom plate here in order for the Enigma to work. And that happens when you push one of these keys. It pushes that activation bar down. And if this little plug has found its way under the bar, it won't go down. So when you're inspecting the machine, the plug is in the back someplace, not near the bar. And then as it gets jiggled and carried around in the field, it suddenly finds the plug gets up here and the machine stops working. Here's another nifty little technique that was used to sabotage them. Some of the screws that held the wires in the plugs down were too long. And when you screw them in very, very tightly, they still aren't going to tighten and crimp down the wire. And so the wire is ultimately loose up here. And although it probably will pass inspection, by the time you wiggle the wire a few times, it's going to loosen up a little more and it's going to stop working. And the most insidious and peculiar sabotage that I found in these machines was that some of the screws were coated with a goo. Here I've taken a screw and I've rubbed it against some material, and you can see this goo coming off. And this goo is absolutely an insulator. You can see it here on this screw and on this screw and on this screw and rubbed off down here. And the result is that if you take an ohmmeter, and here's a clip of an ohmmeter down here, you take a reading of ohms between the pin here and the wire, it's an open circuit because the goo actually insulates the screw from the metal socket in which it's screwed into, and it gradually produces an open circuit. So another technique for sabotaging the machines. At the end of the war, 1945, the Germans were ordered to destroy every Enigma that they had. And they used explosives, and they used guns, and they threw them in lakes, all of this to keep them from falling into the hands of the Allies. But a very strange thing happened, and that is Churchill ordered all of the Allies to destroy every Enigma machine and all of the bombs that they had built and the plans and papers for the bombs at the end of the war. And people have had a lot of trouble figuring out why Churchill ordered this. They actually had a little sheet of paper that went out to the troops in the field saying, if you find an Enigma machine, open it up, and put a hand grenade right in here and set off the hand grenade and run like hell and let it blow up, and we don't want to see any pieces of these machines left over. And so all of the Enigma machines were destroyed in this way as far as we could tell, and there have been very, very few of them left, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the big question is, why did Churchill do this? And just yesterday, amazingly, I figured out, or I found out, the answer. And actually it was last year, and I was told about it yesterday. 70 years after the war, this came to light. And what happened was that Churchill really announced that he had destroyed all of the Enigmas and bombs, but he didn't actually destroy them all. And the reason was that he wanted to use them as kind of a Trojan horse. And one of the things that he did was he was wondering about this developing country called Israel, and this developing state of Israel. And so he gave the Israelis 10 Enigma machines at the end of the war. And nobody knew this. And the Israelis, he said, here, these are great machines, German machines. Why don't you use these for your own security work? And the Israelis took these machines, and this is one of them right here, and they changed the machines to the Arabic alphabet. And you can see down here the letters have been changed, and the letters are also changed on the plug board. And the Israelis used these machines for their own internal security and secure military communications. And of course, the British were calmly able to read everything that the Israelis were saying to each other. They knew exactly what was going on. The big problem was that one of the people who had been working at Bletchley Park returned to Israel. He was an Israeli or Jewish, and he came to Israel, and he saw that the Israelis were using these machines to encode their messages, and he went up to the head of the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, and said, listen, these machines, the British are reading the codes from these machines. And the Israelis immediately stopped using these machines. But clearly what Churchill had done was try to put these machines out so he could spy on the Israelis. And it turns out now that he did this with other countries. He did it with Norway. He did it in South America. And so there were about 20 machines that Churchill gave out of the goodness of his heart to various countries, but he was actually making it so he could read all of their messages. The few enigmas that survive beyond that are very, very hard to find and usually in terrible condition. We'll look at what it's like to go hunting for Enigma machines these days. A few of them are left in the battlefields, along with all of the rest of the results of war, and they're not in very good condition, as you can see here. This is a typical battlefield recovered Enigma, and here's another one, been underground for about 60 years, and here's another one, and they also are found in lakes because the easiest thing for the Germans to do when they had to get rid of something real quick was throw it into a lake. But sometimes they destroyed them and then threw them into a lake. So here's a lake that I heard about in northern Germany, and it sort of looks like a nice bucolic German lake. But I was told that there was a couple of Enigma machines and some machine guns and some radio equipment and torpedoes, and maybe even a crashed German fighter plane in the lake. So I went over there with my scuba gear, and I went to the lake, and I realized that the visibility in the water of the lake was approximately 1/2 inch. That's about that much. And so when you're scuba diving, it's nice to be able to see where you're going. 1/2 inch, you can't even see your finger more than 1 inch in front of your face mask. But nevertheless, I wanted to find that Enigma machine. So I put on my diving gear and went into the lake. And without being able to see anything, I had to have some way of finding things underwater. And so I have this underwater metal locator. And the underwater metal locator, since you can't see the indication, you have to wear these earphones. And you take this thing, you're completely blind, you're waving this thing around on the bottom in the mud, and every once in a while it goes beep, beep, beep. And you reach down and see what it is there and grab that and come back up. And here is the collection of stuff that we were able to bring out of the lake. There's some German radio equipment, the Feldfu portable, about 50 megacycle radios over here, some pieces of a experimental prop sensing torpedo over here, and over here are two Enigma machines. They don't look much like Enigma machines, but they are. One of them is sitting on the bench on the table over here. I hope you'll come up and take a look at it. This is the machine we brought up out of the lake. And the problem was that I recognized when I felt it that it was an Enigma machine, and I got so excited about that that I dropped the metal locator. And I have never found the metal locator since. It just got away completely in zero visibility. And it ended the hunt, but at least I was able to bring up these pieces. And this is what the machine looks like after sitting in the water for 60 years. And one of the questions was, how did it get killed, essentially? We do an autopsy on this thing. What caused that bend in the light bulb panel over there? And I happen to have a friend here in Vermont who has a German Mauser rifle, and he loaned it to me. And I found that the butt of the Mauser rifle exactly fits into the little dent marks and grooves in the light bulb panel. So I knew that the Germans had taken a rifle and bashed it down on this machine. You'll see it over there, and made that. And the front of the Enigma was obviously kicked in. And that was a fairly common way of destroying Enigmas. When the Germans wanted to get rid of them, they would kick in the front panel, the plugboard panel. So I'm pretty sure that's what happened to it. And it's kind of an interesting artifact to have. There are also Enigma machines in submarines to this day. One submarine was sunk off the coast of North Carolina, several of them, U-85, 701, and 352. And here's U-352 cruising along, and here's how U-352 looks on the bottom at this point. Wonderful dive venue. And when you venture inside the submarine, things get really, really scary. For me, that's the limit. I don't like going through holes like that with my scuba tanks on. So I have never actually penetrated through the hatch of a submarine, but some people have. And we'll take a little trip inside the submarine with somebody else this time. Still makes me a little worried just to look at these pictures. Here is a double tank and a person trying to fit through this hole, and you know that that is not an easy fit. And when you move inside a wreck like this, you can't help but stirring up all the dust and the dirt, mud in the wreck, and your visibility usually goes from this down to maybe a couple of inches. And so finding your way back out through the hole is one of the problems. Usually you take a rope in with you and follow the rope back out, but still you only have about 3/4 of an hour of air on your back, and if you don't make it out, you don't make it out. Pretty exciting. When you go into a submarine, you never know what you're going to find. The captain may be sitting there watching you, and this is a skull that's inside this U-boat off the coast of North Carolina. And you may find an Enigma machine. This is an Enigma machine that came up then from the wreck of the submarine's been immersed in salt water for approximately 60 years. And you can still see that there's a keyboard there and a plug board on the front and maybe a light panel if you have a good imagination. There's another, generally submarines carried 2 Enigma machines, so this is the second Enigma that was on board the submarine. And even when you clean it a little bit and try and get some of the mud off, it still doesn't look any too great. I think my lake recovered U-boat, my lake recovered Enigma is a little better condition than this one. Because it is so difficult for these machines to be found, and because there are so few of them, most people believe that there are about 300 left in the entire world, the price has suddenly gone higher and higher and higher, and they're now selling fairly regularly for $250,000, which makes me very happy, since I've been hunting for these things for about 30 years or so, and enjoy bringing them back, restoring them, and selling them to pay for the next trip to hunt for more enigmas. So this machine on the left end of the table is worth about $250,000. The machine to the right of that, when you come up after the talk, take a look at it. That one is one that we are restoring and will be eventually workable and restored. And the lake bottom Enigma will never be restored. I was already offered $75,000 for it. If you can imagine, for that piece of rust over there, it just blew my mind. But I rather like it. I don't think I want to sell it. Anyway, how do you get Enigma machines then? Well, you find really, really nutty people in Germany, and here's one of them. This guy has absolutely dedicated his life to restoring this Me-109 fighter plane. And he will do anything to restore it. And he needed a motor for that Me-109 fighter plane. And he had an Enigma machine, which he was willing to trade me for enough money to buy the motor for his fighter plane. So that's one of the ways of getting an Enigma. You find somebody who somehow has one at the end of the war and kept it, and you trade or buy it from them. This guy really had me worried. He was a German soldier, and it looks like he's still a German soldier, and he was not a person that I wanted to mess with, but he kept smiling, and he said, "Yes, I have an Enigma, and I'll sell it to you." Oh, it still was a little bit scary dealing with him. He was more interested in his machine gun, showing me his machine gun, than the Enigma machine. You meet some very strange people when you're hunting for Enigma machines, and this is my ultimate dream, to find someone who has hidden away several Enigma machines, and it's just been in their basement for 60 years or so, and they're willing to part with them. So when I found this guy and I saw 1, 2, 3 Enigma machines, I almost had a heart attack on the spot. And he wanted to sell them, and we did some business, and one of these machines is the machine that you see in the imitation game. The imitation game Enigma has a fairly high serial number, 17534, meaning it was made late in the war, and I discovered it in Germany, restored it, and then I sold it to Bletchley Park in 2010, and they then provided it for the movie. So it was a lot of fun to see my old Enigma coming alive again on the screen. And over here you can see it in pieces, and I've taken apart one Enigma over here. You can see the inner workings of it, so that you can see what the inner construction of the Enigma is. Other places that I have sold Enigmas to include museums. And of course, one of the big problems in a museum, how do you keep a $250,000 thing on the table safe from being stolen? And as you can see here, this museum has built a bulletproof plastic case around it. You could probably hit it with a 20-pound sledgehammer and it wouldn't budge. But they have this machine on display, and they're very happy with it. That's the Chatham Marconi Maritime Museum on Cape Cod. And then there are individuals who buy these Enigmas for that amount of money. If you can imagine, $250,000 just for a little wooden box with a little typewriter inside it. And this is one of them. This gentleman was the former CEO for Apple Computing Technology. That is, he was in charge of all the technical aspects of Apple computing. And when he retired, I imagine he retired with plenty of money, so it didn't hurt him at all to buy an Enigma machine. And he was so happy with it that he had his Christmas card made with his Enigma on it. You have to be a little nuts to be a collector of Enigmas. Here's a bunch of Enigma historians at Bletchley Park in 2009. I'm over here smiling along with the rest of these guys and their Enigmas. And in my own workshop working on these machines. I have a great time restoring them. Let me move on and talk a little bit about Alan Turing himself, because he is an amazing phenomenon and was a great mathematician, a great logician. And compare Alan Turing with the movie. On the left, we see Alan Turing as a young boy. On the right, we see Alex Lawther, who played Alan Turing in the movie. Did a pretty good job, I think. On the left, the girl that worked with Alan Turing. On the right, the actress who played this girl in the movie. On the left, we have the real Alan Turing, and on the right, the actor Benedict Cumberbatch. And he did a pretty good job of playing Alan Turing, I think, in the movie. Most people thought it was a good job, and I did also. The picture of Cumberbatch on a bicycle was sort of unfortunate, though, because it doesn't really do justice to Alan Turing. Alan Turing was a true nutcase. There was no question about it. In addition to being brilliant, he was nuts. And he never would have been caught dead looking like this with a tie on a bicycle. The real Alan Turing actually pedaled around Bletchley Park with a gas mask on. And the reason, he said, was that he had allergies. But if you can imagine the head of Bletchley Park, the king of all the code breakers, the most brilliant person in Bletchley Park, pedaling around on a bicycle with a gas mask. I think the movie director really missed out by not showing that picture. That would have been a really good laugh in the movie and would have made it, I think, a better movie. Another peculiarity of Turing's was that in Turing's office, he chained his coffee mug to the radiator because he was convinced that somebody was going to steal his coffee mug. And that's another neat thing. But probably the best of all Turing stories, and these are pretty well substantiated, was that Turing himself was pretty convinced that Germany was going to win the war and that the Germans were going to invade England. And he was quite scared, and he decided one day that he was going to take all of his money and he was going to bury it in the woods around Bletchley Park. And so he dug a hole, and he put all of his money in the woods, and he left it there, and he came back about 2 years later, and he couldn't find where he buried the money. And people have been looking in those woods now for the last 60 years with metal locators and everything, trying to find his buried money, but nobody's found it. And I think that would have been a great little piece to have in the movie also. Turing was really beloved by people. I love this quote by one of the people who worked with him. He used to, bless his heart, walk down to the canteen in a curious sideways motion with his head down. But he was such a star. We all thought he was the best wonderful thing. I think that's a great set of words, the best wonderful thing. So you can sort of get a picture of what kind of man this was. And then you juxtapose that with some of the work that he did. One of his areas was neurocryptology, that is, looking at the relationship between encoding of message and the nervous system, and biocryptology, which ended up being the precursor of what we now call chaos theory. And Turing discovered that seemingly random biological processes produce non-random results, and that's sort of one of the underpinnings of chaos theory. He also talked about how decision-making in the brain was similar to deciding about in decoding messages. Incoming information is deciphered by the brain quickly and without error, with the goal being survival. So he looked at the way the brain decoded neural messages as a model for decoding German Enigma messages. He also used a sequential analysis in some of his analyses. This is decision-making strategy based on the clock method developed by, a Polish mathematician named Rosicky. So a lot of wonderful stuff that he did. For those of us who have a little familiarity with computers, I think his work on what he called the Turing machine, and what people call the Turing machine, in 1937 was really quite extraordinary. He designed conceptually, never built, but designed conceptually in his mind and drew pictures of a programmable computer. And the computer consisted of a strip of 35 millimeter film on which there were X's in some of the frames and 1's in other frames, and some of the frames were empty. So there were three possible states for a given frame in this film: an X, a 1, or nothing. And the film would zip through the computer, what he called a Turing machine, and you could write or erase the X's or the 1's or the nothings in these blocks. So essentially, this machine that he conceptualized was similar to what we now think of as a computer memory with a set of binary characters in it. Binary characters, however, can only be 0 or 1. And all of our computers, every computer, every cell phone, everything we're using now is based on two-state logic, where it can either be 0 or 1. Turing, in this initial design of his, had a three-state logic. And that would be the case if now, for instance, we could take our modern computers, instead of having just 0's and 1's in the memory, if we could have 0, an X, and 1, three states. Imagine how much more powerful computers would be. And that was what he designed, and we haven't gotten there yet. So he was so far ahead of us. I like this picture of him particularly because he's sort of laughing at us and saying, ha ha, look what I did, look what I've designed, you haven't even gotten here yet. But you'll get there, keep trying. Wonderful stuff. He also developed the Turing test to try and figure out whether a computer can actually think or not. And the Turing test involves having a person interact with a computer and see whether the person can tell that they are talking with or communicating with a computer. After the war, Turing worked developing advanced computers, worked on some extraordinary computers. In 1952, he was convicted of being a homosexual, which was illegal in England at that time. Given a choice of prison or hormonal therapy, he chose hormonal therapy for 1 year, went back to work, seemed rather happy, and in 1954 he was found dead in his bed with a half-eaten apple and with a lethal amount of cyanide in his body. The coroner's ruling was suicide by cyanide-poisoned apple. But the coroner never tested the apple. The coroner said, well, it's typical for homosexuals at that point to commit suicide. Don't even worry about it. So there is considerable controversy about what actually happened to him as a result of that. But we do know that we've lost an extraordinary person, and a person who could have contributed a great deal, moved our knowledge of computers along much faster than we've gone. You might ask, what did the Americans use for coding information? And the answer is this M209, very simple coding machine, all mechanical, quite a complex mechanical machine. You set this little wheel over here with the plain text letter that you want to encode. You turn a crank over here on the right. These things in the middle do mystical things, and it prints out the ciphertext message on a piece of paper tape. And I have one of those over there for you to take a look at also. The Russians also copied the Enigma machine after the war. They developed a machine which they codenamed Fialka, and the Fialka has 10 rotors, and instead of the rotors going in the same direction, everyone goes in a different direction from its neighbor. A very, very complex and wonderful machine. And if you want more information, come and visit my museum. And I also should point out this device over here. It looks like a ham HT, and it works like that. It covers about 30 to 700 megacycles. And the interesting thing about this device is it has essentially a built-in Enigma machine inside it as a little programmable computer chip. So this little device is the modern version of the World War II Enigma. And that's what I have for you. I hope I didn't take too much of your time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'd love to have you come up and take a look at these things. Anybody have a question?
And if you have a question, please speak up so that we can pick it up on the mic.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thank you. Got a question? Okay. Say.
How many Enigma machines have you acquired?
In 30 years, I have found approximately 50 machines. And it's fun. It's much more fun than deer hunting. And it's probably more dangerous than bear hunting, too, because I'm dealing with guys like that with a machine gun. There was one guy, I bought an Enigma machine from him. He looked at me and he said, "You're an American. And 50 years ago, I would have shot you right between the eyes." He pointed his finger right there. I could almost feel the bullet. And I'm sort of shaking. And then this big smile, he says, "And here I am, selling you an Enigma machine." That was probably the scariest moment that I had in the process. But it's a lot of fun. Anybody else? Yes?
The walkie-talkie, whose machine is that?
It's made by Harris. And they make it for the NSA, the CIA, the president's security. It's the machine that is being used. If you sort of look closely at some of the television shots of what's going on in other parts of the world, the soldiers are all carrying these things. Yeah.
Do they have like more common commercial like reproductions of Enigma machines these days?
That's an interesting question. The Enigma machine's fairly complicated to make, and nobody made a reproduction until a German machinist decided to make one. And he started putting one together. He made all of the parts, and it is so good that I cannot tell. After all the machines I've seen, I can't tell that it's a reproduction. And he finally figured out how much he had to sell it for, and he sells it for about $60,000. And that's how much time he put into it. So it's unlikely that there are going to be many replicas of this, although if the Chinese get the idea that they can get $60,000 for putting something like this together, we might start seeing some replicas. A lot of people would like to find a replica in the $1,000 to $3,000 or less range so they could sort of study it and have the experience of an Enigma, but they aren't out there yet. The neat thing is that you can go on the internet and you can download a software program that will turn your computer into a perfect Enigma machine. It'll have, I don't think I can show it on the screen, but you'll have exactly what you see on the front of the Enigma, and if you push one of the keys on the keyboard, a light will light up, and it will perfectly emulate any of the models of the Enigma, the 3-rotor Enigma, the 4-rotor Enigma, and the commercial Enigma. So just look up Enigma simulator software, and it's free, and you can make an Enigma right on the screen of your computer. That's pretty neat. Anybody else? Yeah?
The discs in the Enigma, were they always simply a rotation, or were they more complex encoding?
They always rotate, and they always rotate one step at a time, like an odometer on a car. The wiring is fixed inside the Enigma disc, so it's always.
Let's say A goes to C. Does B necessarily go to B?
Yeah, if A goes to C, C goes to A. If that's what you're asking, it's just a trait.
In the encoding direction.
Yeah.
If A goes to C, then B would always go to the next letter in the alphabet?
No, it's completely mixed up. That's why the Poles had such a hard time figuring it out. And in addition, after the initial Enigma was made with 3 rotors, the Germans developed 2 more rotors that could be swapped into the Enigma and used if the 3 weren't secure enough, they could just swap another one in any of the positions there. So there are 5 very discrete, specific wiring patterns that you can put into the machine in any one of 60 different possible positions. Anybody else? Yeah.
Wouldn't they have to change the lettering for each number, not alphabeticalized but mixed up, that way they would not be able to necessarily figure out that fast? Or
How would they change the wiring?
yeah.
The Enigma cannot change the wiring. There's no way you can change it, but the Russian machine is amazing. The wiring maze that connects the input and output on that Russian machine that I showed you here. Each of these rotors, the wiring maze can be taken out of the rotor and put back in a different orientation. And you can also flip the wiring maze upside down, making 60 different possible wirings for a given rotor. So they decided to go far beyond what the Enigma can do. Yeah.
How long did they use these mechanical devices into this?
Well, it's sort of electromechanical, and they used them well into the 1970s. You worked on, was it you who worked on the KL7 as American version of basically of the Enigma, had rotors and electromechanical operation, and it produced, what was the output of the KL7 or KW7? Was it tape or was it lights or what?
I never worked on a KL7. I
Right.
worked on KW26s and
Okay.
KG13.
What was the output of that? Just punch paper tape?
Yes.
Okay.
Plain text and then sent to another Air Force base,
Uh-huh.
encoded in plain text out. And
Okay.
punch cards changed every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
So,
common-
but
that's common knowledge, no.
basically the same general technology, just being a little fancier, and you could connect it to a transmitter instead of having to write down the letter and then type it out in Morse code and stuff like that. But the underlying technology was similar.
That,
Yeah.
I've seen that on the internet, or I wouldn't have said it.
Mm-hmm.
The punch card thing. And you can see the machines, they're outdated.
Right, right, and that's still a classified machine. Even the KL7 is classified at this point. Yeah, I would love to get my hands on a KL7, but I haven't been able to. Yes.
One other thing, if the Germans were using these everywhere,
Yeah.
so they would have all these day key books everywhere.
Yeah.
You would think they would have been captured a lot.
They were.
Often.
But somehow the Germans didn't tumble to the fact that when someone had their code book, they had their code.
Right.
I can't explain it. I've spent a lot of time in Germany, and Germans in general like to believe what they believe and not believe what they don't want to believe. In other words, they're stubborn. Very stubborn in this case, yes. Go ahead, ask.
Wouldn't each group have to change wouldn't they each have the same code every single time?
Yes, they had to have the same code for the transmitting Enigma and the receiving Enigma. They had to be the same. And the only way they could be the same is if they had a code books to know what they should set their machine to. I brought some stuff that you might be interested in. The flea market at MIT is every month. There's a World War II museum in Natick, Mass., and there's an antique radio show, whatever, in Westford, which is really neat if you like that kind of stuff. And, of course, the Nearfest. I have seen some of you at Nearfest. Anything else I can tell you about? Yes?
Who built these? Were they
Who?
built by the Germans?
Yeah, the Germans, Volkswagen, yeah. They cheated with the software. There were factories in Germany. Heimselwith and Renke was the name of one factory, and the factory would get bombed and go out of business for a while. Another factory would start up, and little by little, as the war progressed, the machines got crappier and crappier and worse and worse. They even ran out of aluminum for the rotors, so they started making the rotor thumb wheels out of Bakelite. And these factories got bombed consistently. Of course, by reading the Enigma codes, we could tell where the factories were and bomb them. And one of the neat things is that the guy who builds the replica also helps me to repair machines when I really need a part for an Enigma machine to fix it. I go to him. And what he did at the end of the war was really neat. He found out where all the factories were, and he dug around in the bombed out wrecks of the factories, and he got thousands of pieces of Enigmas that had never even been used. They were just down in these craters where the factories had been. So we have a pretty good supply of a lot of little pieces of Enigmas as a result, and that's very helpful in restoring them. Anybody else? Come up and, yeah.
Was Was Kleinschmidt involved in building it?
Not at all, no. The only one you might recognize is Olympia, who made a typewriter, and that was a German typewriter, and in actuality the Olympia typewriter company made Enigma machines. Okay, so again up here we have an Enigma machine which is working, push on it, a taken apart Enigma machine, a Civil War code wheel, a out of the lake Enigma machine, a American code machine, and this incredible piece of hardware. Come up and take a look, and thank you for your attention.